This is a class this evening talking about Beowulf. We're using the Dover edition of Beowulf, the prose translation. And Beowulf, as we get it in modern English, has gone through a long history, a vast history, like the English language has gone through a vast history. And in order to understand where Beowulf comes from, I think it's important to look at a little bit of the history of the language itself. The poem is written in a language called called Old English or Anglo-Saxon, and it was written by an anonymous poet, called the Beowulf poet now, but an anonymous poet, and written roughly around the time of the 9th century. Most scholars seem to put it. The history of the English Isles is a history of people conquering one another because of the great farmland that's there on the Isles. Originally, the inhabitants, as far back as we can tell, first there's the Neolithic peoples, and at some point the Neolithic peoples were conquered by a group of people that were related to the Celtic people, the Scottish and the Irish and Northumbrians, and they spoke Celtic language that the Romans later called Pictish. And the Romans conquered that territory and drove the Celts north and west. They conquered all the way to the south part of Scotland, up to Hadrian's Wall, and then they never conquered Ireland, apparently. But the Romans then settled that territory, and when they pulled back out again, when the collapse of the Roman Empire occurred roughly around 490 AD, they left behind all these farms and settlements and vestiges of original government, of Roman government. But the language was kind of a polyglot of Celtic and Roman by that time. And there was a serious power vacuum. Nobody was in charge of that area to protect it. And so the territory was conquered by their neighbors. The neighbors were a bunch of people who were Danish primarily, and these Danes came over and they conquered most of the territory, again pushing the Celts up to the north and then to the west to the border of Wales, where they were stopped by a character who later comes to be called Arturus Magnus, and we'll come back to him later on. The Danes settled also in eastern Ireland in a city called Dublin, and the Danes divided up the territory of Britain into various groups that we still use now, terms like Essex and Wessex and other terms that have the EX ending in them. Those are East Saxon and West Saxon, and the Danes were called Saxon because they were strong, like stone. The Latins called them stone people, strong people, so they were strong like stone. Saxon being stone in Latin. Well, these Danes then, they brought their language, which was a Germanic language, to the British Isles. And this Saxon, a specific strain of Saxon in England, was called Anglo-Saxon, the English form of the Saxon language. It was related to Germanic languages there in Denmark and Norway and North Germany and all those territories in the northern part of Europe. But it was a specific type of that language, so it had its differences in dialect and strain. And those people then lived in that territory for many years until they were eventually conquered in 1066 by their cousins, actually, the cousins who were Normans, the Germanic peoples who had settled in the northern part, the Norman territory of France, and had so fallen in love with Roman customs that they began speaking Latin. And the Normans spoke then a language which was early French, a form of Latin. And when they came over and they conquered the Danes there in England, the Anglo-Saxon Danes, they conquered them and they suppressed the language of Saxon, Danish, Saxon, and they divided up the land among the Norman lords, and they made slaves or servants of the Saxon people. the Normans, who are more refined, really, than Saxons, at least in their own imagination, and spoke this language, which was early French, they forbade the use of Saxon as a language, and they considered Saxon to be a slavish language. Consequently, many words in Saxon were considered slavish words. That's why, for instance, language is such a fascinating thing. We have two words for the same thing in our language, like autumn and fall, for instance, or pork and swine. In Saxon, swine, like Schwein in German, means the pig. Pig means pig. And pork in Latin, or in Norman, means pig. So when the servants saw the animal running about in the pen, they called it the Schwein, or they called it the pig. But when they brought it into the kitchen and they cut it up and they roasted it and they brought the stuff into their masters, the stuff they brought in was not Schwein anymore, it was pork, it was porcus, as the Latins called it. Or another instance of that is the bacon. The Germanic peoples didn't call it that, they called it Hackfleisch. And Hackfleisch is the same, really, as bacon, but in the Norman, this back cut, the bacon cut, was what they saw on the table. They didn't see Hackfleisch, which is, I think, inimical to the French tongue to say words like Hackfleisch. Anyway, back to English. English then, as the Normans suppressed the Saxon language, the two languages still existed side by side, and the intermingling of the languages then produced a new thing, which was Middle English. And Middle English has many words that are recognizable in it. Old English, or Anglo-Saxon, has a few words. Middle English has many words that are recognizable. And that language lasted for 200-300 years until we come along to the time of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare develops the language into what it is today. The language really hasn't changed since the time of Shakespeare. So Shakespeare is considered the first of the modern English language writers. And his era, the 15th century, late 15th, early 16th century, is the beginning of modern English language. The Middle English language, which was a combination of Norman and Saxon, was punctuated by the author Geoffrey Chaucer, who we will look at a few of his tales, and also the writer of Gawain and the Green Knight, called the Pearl Poet, and we'll look at his stuff as well. The earlier writing, the Anglo-Saxon writing, which is before the Norman conquest, is punctuated with a great deal of smaller stories, riddles, fables, all kinds of adventure stories, which were quite magnificent, and then this one great tale, Beowulf. Beowulf is really a story that is inherited. It's not originally written by English peoples. It is inherited by an English writer. So it begins as oral tradition, being told probably back in Denmark around the campfire, and that story is so great a story that it gets written down eventually. And from all that you can tell, that story is written down in England in something called the Noel Codex, which looks like this here. The Noel Codex is written in around the 8th century. In Anglo-Saxon it's written. In Anglo-Saxon it's the 8th, early 11th, somewhere in there. It's hard to date it, but it is a manuscript which is remarkable, not just because the story is so great, but because it's so well preserved. This was apparently written in England. It owes a great deal to other stories, for instance, like the fight at Finnsburg, the various lays that are sung, the various riddles that are told. Beowulf, the story of Beowulf, is a story which influences the English imagination for generations to come. Now, when we look at the Old English language, we see that there are many words that are not recognizable to us, but there are also many words which are recognizable, which we can pick out along the way and say, well, I recognize that word, I recognize this word. So what I like to do normally is I like to read a recognizable text to people and pick out the words as we go. The Anglo-Saxons used a script which consisted of runes, a runic alphabet, and this Futhark or Futhork script. We saw that in The Hobbit. It's the same thing that Tolkien uses when he goes to write the Dwarvish and Elvish languages in The Hobbit. Tolkien himself was a linguist, and he used that Futhark to construct his languages. But here, for instance, is a piece of literature which you probably are familiar with. It's the Lord's Prayer. And you know this in English already, and here it is in script. And you know this already in English. It's Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. And I'll attempt to read it now in Old English, and I'll then link to a video which reads it better than I do. But this is what it sounds like in Old English. Here's what it looks like in Old English first. Now here's what it sounds like in Old English. Father ur thuthe ert in helfenum, si thin name gehouden, to becometh in riche, gewerteth in vela, on erfan swa in helfenum, urne gedek famle kan leef seal us today, and forgive us ur guiltas, swa we forgiveth urum guiltendum, an ne geleef thu us in kostnene, ac alles us vergifel, so fliche. Now you notice some of the words in here are recognizable. Father, ur, for instance, our, father, father, father. It's not a big stretch. Ur, our. Thuthe ert in helfenum. Helfenum is pretty much the same as heaven. Heaven is just a slight change of helfenum. Sithin nama gehouden. Nama is the same as name. We just elongate the A in modern English. Name, nama. To become in rike. Gewerteth in vila, on erfan swaswa on helfenum. Erfan is the same as erith. Just take off the an at the end. Erfan, erith. Swaswa is something that always gets students to like that phrase, swaswa. That means just as, in the same way. Swaswa on helfenum. Urna gedek vamlikan lef silus todaig. Todaig is pretty much the same as today. We just take off the hard ending of daig, which is day in Old English, and we have today, todaig. An forgive us ur guiltas, forgive, notice, forgive, forgive, us ur guiltas, our guilt, forgive us our guilt, guiltas. Swaswa, we forgiveth urum guiltendum. Anne geler thugus kostnene ac alis us of evil. Evil is the same as evil in our modern English. So you see a lot of the words are similar to what we say even now.